The Holy Gospel, according to St. Matthew, the 10th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus said, "A disciple is not above the teacher, nor a slave above the master. It is enough for the disciple to be like the teacher, and the slave like the master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? So have no fear of them, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known. What I say to you in the dark, tell in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both body and soul in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. And even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. Everyone, therefore, who acknowledges me before others, I also will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I also will deny before my Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." The Gospel of the Lord. On Monday evenings, I have been leading a service of Compline online. Compline is traditionally the final prayer office of the day before going to bed. And the short Bible readings appointed for it are intended to be calming assurances of God's love and protection as the night sets in. And so, we often read words of Jesus like, "Come to me, all whose work is hard, whose load is heavy, and I will give you rest." Or, "Peace is my parting gift to you. Set your troubled hearts at rest and banish your fears." Words like these seem especially good and helpful, not just as we lay down to sleep, but in times of anxiety, stress, and division. Indeed, it would be nice if that's all Jesus ever said, and that we didn't also have to hear words like we find in today's gospel reading. "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have come not to bring peace, but a sword." And these words are part of a whole series of things that Jesus says that point out how difficult life will be, not just for him, but for his followers, for us. These troubling words of Jesus come up in all 4 of our Gospels multiple times. And multiple sayings like this come up every year in our lectionary. And without fail, every time I have to read or preach on words like these, I think, really, Jesus? We've got plenty of stress and conflict and division in the world right now. We really don't need any help with that. I feel that way double right now. Probably you do too. I mean, we're still in the middle of a global pandemic. The pandemic has caused economic suffering throughout the world and the highest rate of unemployment in our country since the Great Depression. Racial discrimination and injustice have been manifesting themselves over and over again. And oh yeah, did you notice that we have a national election coming up in less than 5 months? Really, we do have enough things to cause stress, anxiety, and division. We really don't need Jesus to give us any more. This is the way I always feel every single time I hear these words of Jesus. And yet, that's precisely how Jesus' first disciples probably felt as well. I mean, they also were living in a world in which they were already full up with stress and anxiety and division. Even a casual reading of the Gospels shows us again and again that there were constant fights over politics. You know, what do we do about the Romans? The Romans are here occupying our land. Do we go fight them, like Simon the Zealot, who's one of the disciples? Do we go along to get along, like Matthew, the tax collector, who often was considered to be a traitor because he helped out the Romans? Political divisions all the time. They fought about race. Every time you read about the Gentiles, it's about race. Do the Gentiles get included or not? And if we're going to let them in, do they have to keep kosher? Do they have to be circumcised? What are the rules? These fights happen throughout the New Testament. Spoiler alert, it's not solved by the end of the writing of the New Testament. And of course, they fought about religion. What does this really mean about honor the Sabbath? What's keeping the Sabbath? What's not keeping the Sabbath? What's the greatest commandment? What things do we really have to focus on? You know, all the stuff that you don't have conversations about during Thanksgiving dinner, right? Politics, race, religion, all of that stuff was going on throughout the lives of Jesus and his disciples, and they were already engaged in these divisive debates. It just came with the territory of living in Judea in the first century, whether or not you were a follower of Jesus. You know, you could try to stick your head in the sand and ignore these issues, but it didn't make them go away. And they wouldn't go away because they were important issues that everybody needed to deal with. And I think that's actually why Jesus said stuff like he says in today's gospel reading. Jesus is pointing to the fact that people get wrapped around the axle about things that are important and that have meaning in their lives. And Jesus begins by pointing out that he's come to make God's presence a living reality in the lives of the disciples and in the life of the world. And that's a great thing. But in fact, it caused divisions. It caused divisions among the disciples' own families. You know, who is this Jesus? Is he really who he says he is? You mean you left your job and you're following this guy around? You know, wait a minute. This religion stuff is fine as long as it doesn't get in the way of real life. What do you mean? Jesus has done something in your life that's more important than what I think. And I told you when you were a kid it's supposed to be important. But Jesus called his disciples to take his presence in their life seriously. He promised them that God's movement in their lives really was more important than all the other stuff. And for full disclosure, he told them that like all important things, following him could be divisive, even within their own families. And so Jesus called them to care about following him, because what he was doing and where he was leading them mattered. You know, in years past, we've been tempted to look at that and say, oh yeah, that was difficult for Jesus and the first disciples, but in our world, being a Christian and following Jesus, that's a culturally acceptable, fine thing. But, you know, look around, more and more, it's not. There are not an insignificant number of people in our society who believe that religion in general, and Christianity in particular, is part of the problem, not the solution. And so sometimes even saying, I'm watching church online, can be a divisive thing in a conversation with somebody else. And that's the thing. Jesus called his disciples to take their relationship with him seriously. And if something is important and taken seriously, then it matters. I mean, I care about the stuff that matters in my life, and so do you. And that's why we get caught up in things in the rest of our lives as well. My health and the health of my neighbors matters. Whether we have jobs matters. How we treat and get along with one another in our society matters. And what direction our country is going in, it matters. We don't always agree on how to deal with what matters. In fact, often we don't. But if it matters to all of us, it can cause tension in figuring out how to move forward. And often, it's more than tension. It can cause stress and anxiety and division. But here's the thing, I also think that what Jesus is doing here is more than just stating the obvious, that important things that matter, including him, will cause division. Instead, for as hard as these words are, he's also showing us a path forward in how to live as his disciples in spite of the stress and the conflict and the division that is ultimately going to show up in our lives. See, in a sense, these words of Jesus challenge us to see, in the midst of conflict and division, an opportunity to focus on what's really important in our lives. After all, the reason that anything brings a sword is because it's important. Jesus called his first disciples, and he calls us to consider what's important in our lives, and that includes asking if God's presence and call in our lives really matter to us. And it also includes using a stressful moment like a pandemic to reflect on what's really important. Especially now that we're starting to be able to do a few more things that seem kind of like sort of normal. I mean, what should resume? What shouldn't? What should change? Is Jesus asking me to reassess what's really worth my time and my effort and what my priorities ought to be? I mean, each of us probably have different answers, and not everybody is going to think those answers are right. And we may catch flack from others when we start to say, you know what, after this pandemic, I've decided that my priority is this. And people will go, what? Are you nuts? Why are you doing that? But sometimes, focusing on what's important and asking the question of what really matters and what Jesus wants me to do, that's part of following Jesus. In a sense, these words of Jesus challenge us to see, in the midst of conflict and division, an opportunity to change how we speak with one another and to one another. See, Jesus begins by pointing out that his disciples should expect people will call them names. After all, they called Jesus the devil. That's what Beelzebul is. It's the devil. But it's interesting that Jesus doesn't instruct them to devise snappy comebacks or to call their opponents double devils. Instead, Jesus calls them to talk to people about his love and presence in the world. And the point of that is that the speaking that Jesus calls them to do, the conversations he calls them to have, even with people who don't like them and disagree with them, is that others should experience God's presence and God's light. The point is not to tell other people that they're stupid or wrong. It's actually to help people experience Jesus. And that means that Jesus also calls us to speak with one another and to listen to one another in ways that help others experience God's presence and love. And often, that means speaking in ways that seek to find solutions and bring people together, instead of simply trying to win the fight. And I got to tell you that as Americans, I think we are really terrible at this. We almost always divide up according to handy catchphrases and quick comebacks. And if somebody thinks this or says this, it means all this other stuff. Whereas if they say that, it means all this other stuff. And we shut down. We stop talking to each other. We stop listening. I mean, I probably cannot say 2 sentences about my concern for racism and racial injustice in this country without somebody thinking, it means he doesn't really care about the really legitimate dangers that police officers face. And if I say, well, wait a minute, no, I care deeply about the really dangerous situations that police officers face trying to protect me, somebody's going to think, then he's not really serious about racism. You've probably had these experiences also. And so sometimes we just say nothing. We don't want to get involved in a discussion. But saying nothing means both of those groups think we don't care about either one. And that's the level of discussion that so often happens in the world around us. But Jesus did not call his disciples to stop having conversations with people, and he didn't call people to choose up sides or call each other names. He called them to keep being witnesses of his love and presence in the lives of others around them, even when others disagreed with them, even when others didn't want to listen, even when others didn't ask questions. He said, you do. You keep that conversation going, because that's the only way people are going to see God's light and God's love through you. And sometimes following Jesus means figuring out and modeling a different way of speaking and listening. And what a difference it would make in our world if Christians could model that, especially at times of conflict and division. And I think that these words anyway of Jesus, are a challenge to us to see in the midst of conflict and division an opportunity to live differently into a new reality. Because Jesus, after all, was not simply calling his first disciples to come along on a ride for a couple of years and then they could go back to doing whatever it was they did before. He was calling them to live into the new reality of his resurrection, which transformed their hearts and their minds and their actions for the rest of their lives. You know, it's hard to adapt to new things and new situations. But it's often the case that stress and division and conflict, like Jesus' death and resurrection in the first century and a pandemic today, make it clear that a new day has come, and they actually push us into having to live in a new way and accept a new reality. I mean, that certainly seems to me to be the case with the way we're going to have to live as a faith community moving forward. We're learning that we cannot just go back to the way things were 6 months ago. And I am the first person to confess that if you told me 6 months ago that I would be standing here and saying, you know what, streaming online worship is an imperative for the future, I would have thought you were nuts. I mean, that's not something that was even on my radar as something that was important. But the things that we have been shown through this stressful time have convinced me that just as Jesus called his first disciples to live in a new and different way, Jesus is doing that now for us. And some of those things I think are going to be great, and they're going to be a little bit challenging to figure out, but some of them we're not going to like. I'm not going to like. They're going to create stress and division. But often, sometimes most important, following Jesus means being willing to live into new realities and do different things. In the final analysis, there is no way to avoid situations of conflict, stress, and division. One situation may subside, and probably will, but you can be sure that another is coming down the path quickly to take its place. They come with life, with or without Jesus' words. And following Jesus does not exempt us from any of the conflicts and the divisions of life. But following Jesus does give us a way forward and a new way to live through the conflicts of life. And while it's still hard, following Jesus is a way of living which trusts that God is with us even and especially in the midst of those conflicts. Following Jesus is a way of living which makes us into people who can bring about positive change instead of just people who choose up sides. And most of all, following Jesus is a way of living that gives us confidence to keep on adapting, because no matter what situation we face, we know that God's promise of love and life will win out for us in the end.